What if the Vietnam War wasn't lost in the jungle, but in Washington, before the first major troop deployment even began? What if the outcome was already set in motion, not because American soldiers lacked courage, not because of a single battle gone wrong, but because the objective itself was impossible to achieve? At the height of its power, the United States had overwhelming advantages: superior firepower, air dominance, advanced technology, the strongest economy in the world. On paper, there was no scenario where a small Southeast Asian nation should have been able to outlast a global superpower. And yet the war stretched on. Year after year, troop levels increased, bombing campaigns intensified, casualties mounted. Still, there was no clear victory, no decisive moment, no surrender. So the real question isn't how the war was lost. The real question is this: was it ever truly winnable? Tonight, we're breaking down the structural reasons that shaped the conflict from the very beginning, the strategic decisions, the assumptions, and the limitations that may have made success impossible long before most Americans even understood what the war was about. If you value serious historical analysis that looks beyond headlines and simple narratives, take a moment to like this video. It helps this channel reach others who want deeper context. Now let's go back to the beginning, before the escalation, before the protests, before the turning points, and examine whether the Vietnam War was unwinnable from the start. You can't win a war if you can't define what winning actually means. In Vietnam, that was the first and perhaps most dangerous problem. From the very beginning, the United States entered the conflict without a clear, measurable definition of victory. There was no signed declaration of war, no formal objective like unconditional surrender, no moment where the enemy's capital would be captured and the conflict would officially end. Instead, the mission was framed around something more abstract: containment, prevent the spread of influence, maintain credibility, hold the line. But what does holding the line look like in a jungle thousands of miles from home? Was victory the survival of South Vietnam? For how long? Under what conditions? With what level of stability? Those questions never had simple answers. And without clear answers, strategy becomes uncertain. Military commanders on the ground needed measurable progress. So progress became numbers, body counts, enemy casualties, sorties flown, bomb tonnage dropped, villages cleared. Every week, statistics were reported, charts were presented, metrics suggested movement forward. But numbers are not the same as momentum. If the enemy can replace losses faster than you can break their will, what do the numbers really mean? The war slowly turned into a test of attrition. The idea was straightforward: apply enough pressure, inflict enough losses, and eventually the opponent would decide the cost was too high. Eventually, they would negotiate from weakness. But that assumption depended on one critical factor: that both sides measured cost the same way. They did not. For American leadership, rising casualties translated into political pressure at home. Public opinion mattered. Election cycles mattered. Media coverage mattered. Each additional loss had strategic consequences beyond the battlefield. For the opposing side, the calculus was different. The struggle was tied to national identity, unification, and decades of resistance. Losses were devastating, but they did not automatically translate into surrender. So the United States pursued a strategy designed to wear down an opponent whose threshold for endurance was fundamentally different. And here's the deeper issue. If your goal is to prevent collapse rather than achieve transformation, you are fighting defensively by definition. There was no plan to conquer North Vietnam outright. No large-scale invasion intended to end the conflict decisively. Escalation was gradual, controlled, limited, each step carefully measured to avoid triggering a larger global confrontation. That meant fighting with restraints. Restraints on geography, restraints on targets, restraints on escalation. How do you win decisively when your strategy is designed not to expand the war? This created a paradox. The United States committed enormous resources, hundreds of thousands of troops, sustained bombing campaigns, vast logistical networks. Yet the political objective remained narrow and cautious. Victory was never clearly defined, but escalation was constant. And when soldiers on the ground ask what they are trying to achieve beyond surviving the next mission, clarity matters. If one village is secured today but contested tomorrow, is that progress? If territory is cleared but not permanently held, is that momentum? If success is measured in temporary disruption rather than lasting control, what does the scoreboard really represent? Over time, the absence of a clear end state began to shape every decision. Tactical wins did not accumulate into strategic breakthrough. Operations were launched, objectives were taken, reports were filed, but the larger picture remained unchanged. The war did not move toward conclusion. It simply continued. And that may have been the central flaw from the start, because wars are not won by activity alone. They are won by aligning military action with a clearly defined political outcome. In Vietnam, that alignment never fully existed. The United States was powerful enough to destroy, powerful enough to deploy, powerful enough to escalate, but without a precise definition of victory, one shared across military leadership, political leadership, and the public. The effort lacked a stable destination. And when a nation goes to war without a clearly defined finish line, it may discover, too late, that it has been running in circles. America prepared for a conventional war. What it encountered was something very different. From the outside, Vietnam looked like another front in a global struggle. A map, a border, two sides. It seemed familiar, the kind of conflict industrial power could manage with enough troops, enough aircraft, enough pressure. But on the ground, the reality was not a traditional battlefield. There were no fixed front lines stretching across open terrain, no clear dividing line where one army stood opposite another. The enemy did not always wear uniforms. They did not always operate in large formations. They moved through villages, through forests, through tunnels beneath the earth. And that changed everything. The United States brought overwhelming military capability into Southeast Asia. Helicopter mobility, heavy artillery, strategic bombing, advanced logistics. It was a system designed for large-scale engagement, for decisive clashes, for breaking an opponent's capacity to fight. But Vietnam was not primarily a conventional war between two standing armies. It was a political struggle rooted inside communities. And that meant the center of gravity was not territory alone. It was people. Who controls the village at night? Who provides security? Who earns trust? Who shapes loyalty? Those questions cannot be answered with airstrikes. Military planners focused on search and destroy missions, identify enemy concentrations, engage, eliminate, withdraw. The logic was clear. Remove enough fighters, and the insurgency collapses. But insurgencies are not sustained only by fighters. They are sustained by networks, by local support, by political belief. If one unit is removed, another can take its place, especially if the broader cause remains intact. And here is the tension. Every large-scale military operation risked collateral damage, displacement, civilian hardship, fear. Even when unintended, those consequences influence perception, and perception shaped allegiance. In this kind of war, perception can matter as much as firepower. The United States often measured success in engagements won, enemies killed, weapons seized. But guerrilla warfare is designed to avoid decisive defeat. It stretches conflict. It blurs lines. It turns time into an ally. If you cannot clearly identify the enemy, if the battlefield is also a community, if the objective is to win loyalty, not just eliminate opposition, then conventional superiority loses part of its advantage. This was not a failure of courage. American troops adapted constantly. They operated in difficult terrain. They endured heat, uncertainty, and danger. They executed missions with discipline. But the strategic framework remained rooted in traditional military logic. Escalation meant more troops, more bombing, more pressure. Yet pressure alone does not dissolve political conviction. In fact, in some cases, it can harden it. The war became a contest between industrial strength and ideological endurance, between rapid deployment and long-term commitment, between a superpower fighting to maintain global credibility and a movement fighting for national transformation. Those motivations are not symmetrical. When one side views the conflict as one theater among many, and the other views it as existential, the balance of will begins to matter as much as the balance of weapons. And so the mismatch deepened. America fought to prevent a political shift using military tools. But political legitimacy cannot be manufactured through force alone. Stability cannot be sustained if the underlying structure remains fragile. Each tactical victory raised a larger question. Does this change the political reality tomorrow? If the answer is uncertain, then the battlefield becomes repetitive, cyclical, familiar, clear, hold, withdraw, return. The war did not lack action. It lacked convergence between military method and political objective. And when a war strategy is misaligned with its nature, even overwhelming strength can struggle to produce decisive results. The United States did not enter Vietnam without planning. It entered with the wrong kind of plan for the kind of war it faced. And that misalignment, subtle at first, would shape everything that followed. In Vietnam, time was not neutral. Time was a weapon. At first, American leaders believed that sustained pressure would produce results, increase troop levels, expand operations, maintain intensity. The assumption was simple. Eventually, the opponent would reach a breaking point. But what if the breaking point belonged to someone else? The United States operated on a clock shaped by elections, public opinion, media coverage, and economic cost. Every year the war continued. Questions grew louder at home. Every casualty report traveled across television screens and into living rooms. Every extension of deployment added strain, not just on soldiers, but on families and communities. Time accumulated pressure internally. For the opposing side, the timeline looked different. The struggle was framed as long-term, generational, rooted in national identity and reunification. Endurance was not a side effect of the strategy. It was the strategy. If one side believes victory must come within a politically acceptable window, and the other believes victory comes simply by outlasting that window, who holds the advantage? The United States rotated troops in and out on limited tours. Soldiers often served 1 year before returning home. That system reduced long-term individual strain, but it also meant units were constantly changing. Experience cycled. Local knowledge reset. Relationships with communities restarted. Meanwhile, opposing forces operated within familiar terrain. Networks matured over time. Adaptation deepened. The battlefield did not reset every 12 months. Time layered experience on one side. It layered fatigue on the other. And then there was perception. At the beginning, support at home was strong. The conflict was framed within the broader global struggle. But as years passed without visible progress toward a clear conclusion, uncertainty replaced confidence. How many years is enough? How many troops are enough? How many operations signal that the tide has truly turned? Without a defined finish line, duration itself becomes a signal. The longer a war continues without decisive results, the more it invites doubt. Doubt influences policy. Policy influences strategy. Strategy influences morale. Time begins to shape the battlefield as surely as geography. Large-scale offensives could achieve tactical success, but if they did not shorten the war or redefine its trajectory, the clock kept ticking, and the ticking mattered, because democracies feel time differently than revolutionary movements. Political leadership must answer to voters. Public tolerance has limits. Budgets have limits. Attention has limits. On the other side, leadership framed the struggle as historical. Sacrifice was tied to legacy. The horizon extended far beyond a single election cycle. That asymmetry changed the nature of pressure. For American forces, each year raised the stakes of justification. For the opposing side, each year reinforced the belief that persistence itself was progress. If you cannot be defeated decisively, and you can endure longer than your opponent's political patience, then time works in your favor. This does not mean there were no battlefield victories. There were many. Operations disrupted networks. Engagements inflicted losses. Tactical superiority was often clear. But tactical success does not automatically compress time. If after each surge, each escalation, each campaign, the fundamental structure of the conflict remains intact, the duration itself becomes the dominant factor. And duration reshapes everything. Families wait. Public trust shifts. Questions multiply. At some point, the conversation changes from, "Are we winning?" to, "How long will this continue?" That shift is subtle, but once it happens, momentum begins to move in a different direction. In Vietnam, The side that needed a clear and timely victory was not the side built for generational endurance. And when time becomes the decisive terrain, the stronger military does not always hold the stronger position. Vietnam was never just about Vietnam. That may be the most uncomfortable truth of all. From the beginning, the conflict was viewed through a much larger lens, not simply as a regional struggle, but as a test of resolve in a global contest. Decisions were shaped not only by events in Southeast Asia, but by fears of what those events might signal elsewhere. Credibility became a central word. If the United States stepped back, what message would that send? If one government fell, would others follow? If commitments appeared fragile, would alliances weaken? The war was folded into a broader strategy of containment. The belief was that allowing one shift in balance could trigger others. The stakes were framed not as local instability, but as global momentum. But when a war is fought primarily to preserve reputation, ending it becomes complicated. Because how do you measure credibility? How do you declare it secured? At what point is the message sent? This is where the structure tightens. If the objective is to defend an ally, that has boundaries. If the objective is to defeat an opposing army, that has metrics. But if the objective is to demonstrate resolve to the world, the finish line becomes abstract. And abstract goals are difficult to complete. Escalation was often incremental, each step calibrated, each decision weighed against the risk of a wider confrontation. There were limits placed on targets, limits placed on geography, limits placed on expansion. The war was intense, but controlled. It was designed to send a signal without igniting something larger. And that balancing act created a strategic tension. On one hand, enormous resources were committed. On the other, total victory was never fully pursued. The conflict existed in a space between full-scale war and limited engagement, too large to ignore, too restrained to conclude decisively. At the same time, policymakers had to consider the reactions of other global powers. Every move carried secondary consequences. Every escalation was evaluated beyond the immediate battlefield. So the war became layered. A military campaign, a diplomatic calculation, a message to allies, a message to rivals. But here is the deeper question. When a war is primarily about preventing the perception of weakness, does that objective become self-sustaining? If withdrawing risks appearing weak, and continuing produces mounting cost, the decision space narrows. Vietnam gradually became a symbol, not only of strategy, but of resolve. And symbols are harder to release than territory. The problem is that symbols do not respond to firepower. Bombing campaigns could strike infrastructure. Troop surges could disrupt operations. But neither could conclusively settle the broader geopolitical narrative. Because the narrative was global. And that meant the conflict's purpose was never fully anchored to the terrain where it was fought. American soldiers operated in villages and jungles. Policymakers operated within a worldwide chessboard. Those two realities did not always align. When battlefield outcomes failed to clearly shift the global perception they were meant to influence, frustration builds. Adjustments are made. Strategies are revised. But the underlying objective remains intangible. Vietnam became a war sustained partly by the fear of what ending it might imply. And that is a difficult foundation for victory. Because wars built on concrete objectives can end when those objectives are met. Wars built on reputation end only when leaders decide the cost of continuation outweighs the risk to image. That is not a battlefield calculation. It is a political one. So when we ask whether the Vietnam War was unwinnable from the start, we have to look beyond tactics, beyond troop numbers, beyond individual battles. We have to examine the architecture of the decision itself. A war without a clearly defined victory, fought with tools misaligned to its nature, bound by time that favored the other side, and anchored to a global perception that could not be decisively secured. The question isn't about courage. That was never in doubt. The question is structural. Was the objective achievable within the limits that were imposed? Or was the conflict destined to exhaust itself under the weight of its own design? Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe the war could have been won under different leadership or strategy? Or were the foundations flawed from the very beginning? Share your perspective in the comments. I read them carefully. And if you value deep, structured analysis of the wars that shaped American power, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Because sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in the decisions before the first shot is fired.